Good morning, colleagues. It is my pleasure to be part of this program, and I'm thankful for the organizers for considering me to take part. Naturally, I'm a fast speaker, so today I've been cautioned to speak slowly, so I will do my best to be a slow speaker today. And please feel free to send a chat if I'm speaking faster and you're not maybe understanding what I'm trying to say. So today it's my pleasure to present on how we can integrate the fair and care principles in digital preservation of indigenous knowledge. Right. In this digital age, we can say that the issue of preserving indigenous knowledge is quite a technical and ethical endeavor. Why do I say that? Because by just looking at the nature of indigenous knowledge and the characteristics, we can see that it's quite an issue to digitize it because it encompasses the unique cultural practices and traditions of indigenous communities. So just because indigenous knowledge is communally owned, it might be a challenge in digitizing it. But now we're looking at the issue of globalization, looking at the issue of digital technologies that are happening in the world we are living in. We are saying that indigenous knowledge systems face increasing risks of misrepresentation, exploitation, as well as extinction if it is not managed carefully. So why are we worried about preserving indigenous knowledge? We see that it has got a crucial role in achieving the sustainable developing goals as well as achieving the Africa that we want. Because if we look at the 17 sustainable development goals, looking at zero hunger, we can say that there are so many activities that are done in how indigenous communities do their planting, how they partake in different agricultural activities in meeting the food needs of the communities. So they know how to do these things. If we look at the issue of health, there are quite a number of herbs and indigenous knowledge that is available within indigenous communities that they can use and utilize to ensure that the community is healthy. If we look at the issue of climate change, they know ways of detecting how these issues are taking place as well as dealing with them. So looking at all the 17 sustainable development goals, we can see that indigenous knowledge have a role to play in achieving them. Now this address is about how now can we integrate the care and fair principles as a way of preserving indigenous knowledge so that we can be able to access it and utilize it in achieving these sustainable development goals as well as achieving the Africa we want. And now looking at the digital tools and IK preservation, we can say that in the digital tools, they play a crucial role in digitizing indigenous knowledge because they document, they preserve, they disseminate indigenous knowledge as a way of ensuring that it remains accessible to future generations. Remember, indigenous knowledge previously, it has been owned by the community and it has been passed from one generation to the other through word of mouth. But if we look at it now, we are seeing that there were issues that were cropping up, and there was a proverb that was being used saying if an old man dies, the whole library disappears. So as a way of trying to solve those issues, now we are saying digital technologies can now assist us in ensuring that it is accessible by future generations. And then we are saying that these digital technologies, they play a major role in archiving and documenting indigenous knowledge. Now there are digital archives, there are databases, there are repositories that serve as central locations where indigenous practices, stories, songs, skills are captured and made widely accessible. And then we also have libraries, we have museums, we have universities and other knowledge centers which are doing digital projects to collect indigenous artifacts, historical records, and oral narrations so that they'll be able to archive and document this indigenous knowledge. So now we are saying that it requires an understanding of how to present the knowledge without stripping it of its cultural significance. Remember, it's very, very important to the community that holds that knowledge, as well as the other general public as well. Now, we can also say that these digital technologies enhance access and dissemination of indigenous knowledge. So we are saying that we'll be making indigenous knowledge accessible to a broader audience. Looking at it from the previous years, indigenous knowledge was just accessible to those who are within that community. When you don't get into that community, you would know what is known and what is utilized within that community. Now, quite a number of platforms are being used to enhance access and dissemination of indigenous knowledge, e.g. social media platforms, mobile applications, various websites, and digital learning platforms as well. They are now being used to disseminate indigenous knowledge to make it accessible to the broader audience. And we're also saying that this digitization, it increases the visibility of indigenous knowledge on global platforms. So now we are saying not only those within the community know how to use this knowledge, but now a lot of people from other countries, from other regions, they can now utilize indigenous knowledge because of the globalization issue and the digital transformation that is taking place within the world that we are living in. However, although there are some good things that come out from digital technologies, we can say that they also present ethical challenges when we are looking at the documentation, the dissemination, and the use of indigenous knowledge, mainly the issue of intellectual property, the cultural sensitivity of indigenous knowledge, and the risk of exploitation of this indigenous knowledge if it is not used properly. Now I'm looking at the challenges in digital preservation. We are saying indigenous knowledge is shared communally with the traditions and practices that are deeply embedded within the cultural fabric of the communities where that indigenous knowledge is. Now we are saying digitizing and sharing this knowledge, it raises important questions, mainly on who owns this knowledge and who has the right to control its use. Why? Because we are saying the community owns that knowledge. No, now who has the right to control its use in terms of this digital era? The other challenge is the issue of digital divide and the technological access. If we look at it, even within urban areas, the digital divide is prevalent. Now, looking at rural areas, that one now is more prevalent. Why? Because other indigenous communities, they don't have access to what we are accessing in the urban areas. Some of them, they don't even have the necessary infrastructure to digitize their indigenous knowledge. And then some, they don't have even access to the internet. Some, they don't have reliable electricity. And then some of them, they don't have even the modern digital devices that can be used to capture and document indigenous knowledge and make it accessible to the community. And then the issue of cultural integrity and representation. We are saying here, by the nature of indigenous knowledge, some of the aspects, they are just meant to be shared within specific cultural and spiritual contexts. But because of digital technologies, if we digitize them, this may expose the IK to unintended audiences, which can violate cultural protocols. Remember, there is what is regarded as positive IK. There is also what is regarded as negative IK. Some of the IK is detrimental to society. So if that one is digitized and made accessible to other people out there, it might violate the cultural protocols within how indigenous knowledge should be utilized. And then we'll also look at the intellectual property and ownership. This issue of who owns the indigenous knowledge, it might risk it in terms of misappropriation or exploitation when this IK is digitized and made available on open access platforms. So we need to think about the issue of intellectual property and ownership of IK when we are about to digitize it. And then the issue of consent and control over IK. There have been instances whereby external researchers and institutions have done digitization efforts without fully consulting the community which owns that knowledge and obtaining their informed consent. And this raised some ethical issues, because when you deal with indigenous people, you should ensure that you get consent of digitizing their knowledge. Without that, you'll be going off bound. And then the issue of sustainability. Remember, when you digitize something, it just doesn't mean that it's one-off thing and you are done. After digitizing, there's need to ensure that those digitizing objects are accessible and findable. So here we are saying that ensuring the sustainability of IK in digital formats, it requires not just the initial investment, but there's ongoing efforts that should be done to ensure that the digitized objects are accessible. You need to update the digital infrastructure. You need also to maintain the digital infrastructure. So this might be an issue in terms of digitizing indigenous knowledge. And then the issue of resource limitations. In some cases, some institutions or some organizations may lack the necessary infrastructure that is needed to support the digitizing efforts to ensure that that IK is always accessible to the future generations. So we are saying that there are resources that are needed, there are funding issues that may come into play, the technological infrastructure that might come into play, and the issue of skilled personnel. If people are not able to make use of the digitized formats, then it means that the information, the knowledge won't be accessible. So we need skilled personnel to work with digitized indigenous knowledge. And then the issue of balancing commercialization with preservation. Sometimes people commercialize their IK, but if we look at it, commodification, it risks reducing the cultural and spiritual significance of IK if they just turn their commodities for profit instead of ensuring that there is a living tradition within that indigenous knowledge. So there is need for a balance. When you're commodifying it, ensure that that living tradition within the indigenous knowledge is also preserved. And then there are some ethical implications that also comes into play when we talk about digitizing indigenous knowledge. Now we are talking about how can we balance public access to IK with the need to protect sensitivity and sacred information. Remember, I said some of the IK is just for the community. It shouldn't go out of the community. So now when that is digitized, now how do you balance that? Access to the positive IK and then access to the negative IK, which is sensitive and sacred within that community. So we are saying here, open access repositories must be mindful of how IK is categorized and distributed so that there is no misappropriation or commercialization of indigenous knowledge without the consent of the indigenous knowledge holders. There is need always to have informed consent from the owners of that knowledge. Remember, be it a researcher, when you are researching about indigenous communities, the proper documentation, the processes should be done. Let's say you are a UNISA student, it should go through the ethical review board so that they will review and give you permission to go and do that study and research it and document whatever you're documenting. And if it means also publishing the results, you should also get informed consent of the knowledge holders to be able to interact with them so that you won't go off bounds. They'll be able to know what is it that you are taking, how are you going to make it accessible, how are you going to protect the information that should be protected from that indigenous community. Now, looking at all these challenges, how now can we solve some of those issues? Now we saw the emergence of two principles that came into play as a way of trying to ensure that some of those challenges that are faced when preserving indigenous knowledge digitally can be solved. The issue of the CARE principles. CARE is an acronym standing for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, as well as the FAIR principles, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. So these two principles now, we are saying, how can we integrate them to ensure that those challenges that I've been talking about previously are solved? Now, let me just do a brief history of the FAIR principles. How did they come into play? These FAIR principles were done to enhance the management and sharing of scientific data, fostering better data reuse across research disciplines. There were quite a number of data sets, and people were worried now on how they can share those data sets. How can they make the data sets accessible, and how can they make it reusable? So here we are saying that there was a growing need for robust and transparent data stewardship to promote open science and research collaboration globally. So in 2014 in Leiden, Holland, there was a workshop which was held called Jointly Designing a Data Fairport. This one, it was like a stakeholder approach whereby academics and those within the private stakeholders from research institutions, policy, publishing, semantic web, life science research, they came together and then discussed on how they can deal with this issue of managing and sharing scientific data. And then within that workshop, there were some questions that they wanted to answer. Now there's a data set. How can we access it? There's a data set. How can we make sure that it is reusable so that other researchers will be able to access that data and make it use of it as a way of reproducing research instead of reduplicating, going into the field and collect data that has already been collected by others. So now these are people, they aimed to support existing communities, trying to find solutions to problems in scientific data retrieval and use. So in 2016, finally, the FAIR Guiding Principles of Scientific Data Management and Stewardship was published by Scientific Data Journal, and it stipulated or maybe articulated how data sets can be made fair. Now looking at these FAIR principles now, how can it be applied to Indigenous knowledge digital preservation? We will discuss that as we go. And then when we look at findable, we are saying that metadata are assigned a global, unique, and persistent identifier, and the data are described with rich metadata. Metadata is just data about that data set. And then metadata clearly and explicitly include the identifier of the data it describes so that you'll be able to find it. And then metadata are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. If it is not searchable, then you won't be able to find it. And then accessible, we are saying the metadata are retrievable by their identifier using a standardized protocol. And then the protocol is open, free, and universal. Protocol authentication and authorization is needed. Remember, I said in terms of IK, some of the IK should be accessible, some of them is sensitive and should only be accessed by authorized people. And then metadata are accessible even when the data are no longer available. Just in case that this data is sensitive, you don't want to share that data set, we are saying that the metadata can be made available so that you can know that there is this data set, but it is closed. You won't be able to openly access it, but you need to seek authority first from the knowledge holders who will give you access to that data set if they are satisfied. And then under interoperable, we are saying that this metadata use a formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language. And then the metadata use vocabularies that follow FAIR principles. Metadata include qualified references to other metadata. And then under reusable, we are saying that these metadata are richly described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. And then metadata are released with a clear and accessible data usage licenses. Remember, you need to guide your users on how they can utilize the data that is available. Is it freely accessible? Is it CC by? Is it CC by 4? There are quite a number of usage licenses that are available that you can attach to your data set to guide the users on how they can use that data. And then metadata are associated with a detailed provenance, and metadata meet domain relevant community standards. So we are saying that the standards should meet the needs of the community. So in summary, we can say that data and material enriched with metadata assigned with a unique identifier is the aspect of findable. And then data and metadata stored in a trusted repository with an open and free protocol accessible by both machines and humans is the issue of accessible. And then using vocabularies and public domain ontologies, the data can be referenced and linked. Here it's interoperable. And then additional documentation and protocols describing the acquisition of the data licensed with a detailed provenance make it the data reusable. Remember, we are saying that in this when you go into the community to collect this data, there are financial issues that are part of the process. So instead of going to the community now and then to collect the same data, let's say I'm doing a research on indigenous communities in Mpumalanga, and then the next person is doing the same research, but maybe just slightly different from what I'm doing, but wants to collect the same data. Instead of going back to Mpumalanga and collect the same data that I collected, I can ensure that my data set is accessible, and then that person will just utilize that data set to draw conclusions from it. That's the issue of reusability. We are talking about reproducibility of research. Now let's look at the history of care. The care principles came after the FAIR principles. So these were introduced by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance in 2019 as a complementary framework to the FAIR principles. So these people who discussed and came up with the care principles, they found out that while initiatives like the FAIR principles emphasize openness and accessibility, they often fail to recognize the unique cultural sensitivity surrounding indigenous data. Remember, we are saying that indigenous data is communally owned. The nature of indigenous data makes it very difficult to preserve and make it accessible. So there are some cultural sensitivities that are surrounding indigenous data. And then these people find out that, yes, we have been talking about the FAIR principles. We are talking about openness. We've been talking about ensuring accessibility of data sets. But when we are dealing with indigenous data, it's a different issue. Now, we should go a step forward. And then there were also historical injustices that were faced by indigenous communities for centuries, whereby their lands, their resources, and their knowledge were exploited, and some of them were taken away from them. And then the issue of the colonial practices also led to the extraction of indigenous data without consent, leading to the misuse or misrepresentation of IK and cultural practices. And then this legacy of data extraction, it contributed to the mistrust between indigenous peoples and external researchers or institutions. That's why nowadays you might find it very difficult to go into the indigenous communities to collect data. It's because of that mistrust that was done maybe during the colonial era, historical injustice, whereby people were just coming from other countries to collect the indigenous knowledge within indigenous communities without getting the consent of those who are involved in making use of that indigenous knowledge. And then when they go out there, they were going, sometimes they were misusing it, sometimes they were misrepresenting it, saying that this is used for this, when in principle it's not used for that. And then now we are talking about the issue of data sovereignty. This one, it emphasizes that indigenous communities should have authority to make decisions about how their data is collected, how their data is accessed, how their data is used, and then aligning it with their self-determination and governance structures. So what are these care principles? It's just a framework to ensure that indigenous peoples have control over the governance, the collection, the ownership, and the use of their data to ensure that it is used ethically and responsibly. So it helps to minimize the tension between protecting indigenous rights and interest in data, as well as supporting open data. So if you look at it closely, we can see that the care principles, they help to open up indigenous knowledge data, but with taking into cognizance the issue of the sensitivity and cultural issues surrounding the use of indigenous knowledge. So now there's a growing concern that global data initiatives, including the open data movement, often overlook the unique rights and cultural values of indigenous communities. But looking at the care principles now, they are coming to solve those issues that were cropping up because of issues of openness and accessibility of Indigenous data. So these are the care principle for equitable outcomes so that all the people or stakeholders involved in using Indigenous data benefit at the end. And then for improved governance and citizen engagement. And then authority to control, it's about recognizing the rights and interests of Indigenous communities, data for governance and governance of data, responsibility for expanding capabilities and capacity for positive relationships and for Indigenous languages and worldviews. And then ethics, here we are saying we need to minimize harm and maximize benefit when dealing with Indigenous data, and for justice and for future use of that data. So in summary, we can say that collective benefits, these are the benefits to Indigenous people and which are key to data analysis, purpose, practice, and translation. And then the authority to control, we are saying that Indigenous authority, they need to control access and analysis of their data in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. And then responsibility, those who work with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. Remember, every stakeholder that is involved within the use of Indigenous knowledge, be it a researcher, be it an organization that is digitizing that IK, be it the knowledge holders, be it the data stewards, be it any people who are part and parcel of digitizing Indigenous knowledge, they are responsible in terms of ensuring that Indigenous data is digitized and made available according to cultural protocols. And under ethics, we are saying commit to minimize harm and maximize benefits to Indigenous peoples through data collection, integration, and analysis and translation practices. So in short, that's the care principles. They are just there to ensure that Indigenous communities are part and parcel of the digitization process when preserving Indigenous knowledge in the digital era. So now, how can we integrate fair and care principles when we are talking about digital preservation of Indigenous knowledge? Here we are saying that there is a tension, we can't run away. There is a tension between these two principles. If you look at fair, if you look at care, fair is talking about openness, care is talking about collective benefit of the Indigenous communities and their authority to control what is shared and how it is shared. So there's a tension between these two principles, and there's a need to ensure that the rights and benefits of Indigenous peoples are respected, whilst we are promoting accessibility ethically and responsibly. So the adoption of open access models and the FAIR principles, while we acknowledge that they make data and knowledge more accessible, this can often overlook the issues of Indigenous knowledge preservation. If we look solely on FAIR, because when you talk about IK preservation, the care principles comes into play and the two should be balanced. And then the issue of ethical challenges, including the unauthorized use of culturally sensitive information, may undermine the collective rights of Indigenous peoples to control their knowledge. And then the issue of the care principles also advocate for Indigenous communities' authority over their knowledge, but may create friction with the ideals of openness and reusability promoted by FAIR. So all these issues now, they can lead us to the issue or importance of integrating both the FAIR and care principles when we are talking about digital preservation of Indigenous knowledge. So now we are saying that this problem, it lies in finding a balance between openness and control, accessibility and sovereignty, and then ensuring the Indigenous communities can benefit from technological advancements without compromising their rights and cultural integrity. So we need to balance the two because of the globalization issues that are taking place. Now let me look at the successful cases that have managed to integrate FAIR and care in dealing with Indigenous knowledge preservation in the digital era. The first one is the Mukutu project. This one is a content management system that was developed to address the needs of specific Indigenous communities in managing, sharing, and preserving cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. This one was developed in Australia. There were researchers who devoted their time in studying how best they can digitize Indigenous knowledge. And they go out to the Indigenous communities and engage them and talk with them. And then they later on find out that this is the best process to do it. And they developed this content management system with the Indigenous communities. So the Indigenous communities had played a major role in developing the digital technology that they are now utilizing to archive and document, as well as provide access to their Indigenous knowledge. So Mukutu, it means a dilly bag in Warumungu language. This one it refers to a traditional woven bag used by Indigenous communities to hold sacred items shared only with authorized people. The items that will be in that bag is very sacred. Not just anyone can access it, but only those who are authorized to access the items within the bag will be able to access it. So the idea of this content management system, it arose from this cultural metaphor, symbolizing a secure and respectable repository for sacred knowledge. So we are saying here, not anyone can just access the knowledge unless if you are authorized to access it. So this Mukutu knowledge management system, it empowers Indigenous peoples to control how their cultural materials are stored, accessed, shared, ensuring respect for traditional protocols and community preferences. The community has a major role in ensuring that their knowledge is safe, their knowledge is well kept, their knowledge is accessed with only those who are authorized to access it. So a culturally appropriate platform that allows Indigenous people to define, monitor, and enforce access to their knowledge based on traditional values and governance practices. They have their own way of doing their things. And as a result, this also was taken into consideration when developing this content management system so that they'll be able to control the accessibility and the documentation of their Indigenous knowledge. It is designed to integrate Indigenous protocols into the digital world, ensuring that cultural knowledge remains in the control of the community. So here we are saying, even researchers, they go to the Indigenous communities and collect the data. When it comes to archiving and documenting, they do it within their content management system so that they'll have control of how the knowledge is accessed. So it ensures that Indigenous people retain full control over their knowledge while enabling findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability within the context of community-defined protocols. Remember, we said under the care principles, we are talking about collective benefit, meaning that the Indigenous communities should benefit from the use of their Indigenous knowledge. We are talking about authority to control. We are saying that the Indigenous communities should control how their data is collected, how their data is used, how their data is accessed, and by whom. And then when we're talking about responsibility, we say that both the Indigenous community and the researchers or the data stewards have a responsibility to ensure that cultural protocols are taken into consideration when giving access. So here we are seeing a content management system that have managed to balance the fair and care principles. So this is the management system whereby we are saying that now they've opened it up to all those who are interested in archiving Indigenous knowledge so that they can utilize this content management system, and then they'll be trained on how to utilize it, how to ensure that cultural community protocols are taken into consideration, how to ensure that these other people within the community are able to utilize the content management system, because not two technical skills are required once the system is set up. So this is a safekeeping place for Indigenous knowledge. And then there is the SAICH program, which stands for Southern African Intangible Cultural Heritage Program. This one is an initiative that is aimed at preserving and promoting African IK and cultural heritage using digital technologies in Africa. And currently, 7 countries are participating within this initiative, which is Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Malawi, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So what they do, they collaborate with Indigenous communities and the cultural institutions, as well as local experts. And those Indigenous communities have a big role to play in terms of how they archive their Indigenous knowledge. And they also control the database that is there where Indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage issues are being archived and documented. And then these Indigenous people, they are central to the process of collecting, curating, and managing their cultural data. No one from outside will come and interfere, but those from within the Indigenous community, they collect their data and then they upload it. They call them the elements. And within those elements, there is metadata for those elements. And it's comprehensive so that people will be able to find what they need whenever they are authorized to utilize their database. And then the community leaders and cultural custodians, they define the protocols for access to sensitive materials. You don't just go and access the information that is regarded as sensitive, but you need to seek permission from the community leaders first, and then after you are given permission, that's when you'll be able to access the materials. And then the communities can determine which materials are open to the public and which are restricted. They have full control over what they share. They have full control over what is accessed. They have full control of their Indigenous knowledge. So the issue of misuse, the issue of exploitation, the issue of misrepresentation is eliminated because the community is very much involved in how they can manage and preserve their Indigenous knowledge. So these cultural materials within the site project are managed in a way that respects the rights of Indigenous peoples while promoting access and usability for future generations. So if we look at this project, we are seeing that they've tried to balance the FAIR principles to ensure that the materials are findable, accessible, reusable, and the CARE principles because they have control over what is accessed and what is not accessed. So that's the South African Intangible Cultural Heritage Cooperation page. You can go and look at what is there. Unfortunately, the database is not accessed by anyone. You need to log in for you to be able to access it, but it's a comprehensive database. Each country has its own database where they upload their elements, and those Indigenous people are part and parcel of this project. And then we have the Ulwazi program in Durban. This one, it represents an innovative approach to IK management that aligns with both the CARE and FAIR principles. It's at the municipality of eThekwini. And this one, it's good because it focuses on community participation. People within the community are the ones that upload their cultural heritage or their Indigenous knowledge that they have. And then it also concentrates on ethical stewardship, whereby the issue of ethics is taken into consideration. You need prior consent for you to be able to upload whatever you upload. And then the responsible use of Indigenous knowledge, whereby these people, they have control over what is accessed and what is not. And then it ensures that cultural heritage is preserved, shared, and used in ways that respect the rights and values of the communities involved. And these communities have the authority to determine which knowledge should be shared publicly and which should remain restricted. And then the project also encourages contributors to follow community-approved protocols when sharing their knowledge. They need approval from the community elders in order for them to upload whatever they'll be uploading. And then it also provides training for individuals involved in the collection of knowledge to ensure that ethical standards are maintained during the documentation process. These are regarded as field workers, and field workers are taken from the community. And then they know the protocols, they know the elders, they know the IK that is available. And then they go to the elders to seek permission to collect whatever they collect. And before they can document the IK, they talk also to the elders and get permission to do so. So they are trying to balance the FAIR and the CARE principles to ensure that their Indigenous knowledge is accessible to the future generation. So that's the website for the Ulwazi program. You can also try to engage with it and then see how things have been operating. It has been very vibrant. And a lot of information was being posted on the website. Now, how can we do it as researchers of Indigenous knowledge? How can we do it as institutions that are archiving Indigenous knowledge? How can we balance these care and fair principles in digital preservation of Indigenous knowledge? Now we can see that if you look at the fair principles and the care principles, there is a balance that should be done when you are archiving, documenting, providing access to Indigenous knowledge. So here we can say that you can pair findability with collective benefit, whereby we are saying respect both scientific standards for data management and the rights and values of Indigenous community. Make sure you make it findable, but it should be also benefit the Indigenous community. And then you can do this by ensuring that metadata and Indigenous knowledge data are findable by using standardized machine-readable formats and assigning persistent identifiers to your Indigenous data. And then the knowledge must be findable in a way that benefits the Indigenous communities, ensure that access to the data directly serve the community's interests. The interests of the community should be at the top when you are ensuring the findability of their Indigenous data. And then you can also design systems where Indigenous communities define how their knowledge is represented and discovered, taking a lesson from the Mukutu project, whereby the researchers went into the community and worked with the Indigenous communities to develop the content management system. So make it a point that the Indigenous people are part and parcel of whatever you will design to make their knowledge discoverable. And then create metadata that includes Indigenous terms and languages, ensuring the community has control over how knowledge is contextualized and who can find that knowledge. And you can also make use of Indigenous-led repositories or platforms that give Indigenous groups authority to determine the reach and benefits of sharing their knowledge. So pair findability with collective benefit to ensure that it's findable, but within the interests of the Indigenous community. And then you can also with authority to control. Here we are saying that you should ensure that Indigenous knowledge is accessible to those who need it using standardized access protocols. And the Indigenous people must retain the right to control who access the knowledge and under what conditions. And this can be done by implementing tiered access, whereby we are saying that there will be different levels of permissions that are given in terms of access available within the database, so that you will be granted community consent to access especially sensitive materials. And then develop culturally sensitive access rules, ensuring that knowledge considered sacred or private remains under community control. If you just open it up without ensuring the authority to control within the Indigenous peoples, then there might be a problem, because even sensitive materials will be accessed by those who are not supposed to access it. And then you can pair interoperability with responsibility. Here we are saying that the data should be interoperable using standardized formats and vocabularies that facilitate reuse and integration with other systems. And then the responsibility to preserve, to share, and use Indigenous knowledge lies with both data stewards and users. So all the stakeholders that are part and parcel of the use of Indigenous knowledge have got a responsibility to preserve and ensure that the data is accessible ethically. And then ensure that it is done in ways that respect the cultural context and values of the originating communities. And the major parties involving Indigenous communities in the creation of interoperable data formats that include culturally appropriate protocols. And then when integrating Indigenous knowledge with other data sets, ensure that the context is not lost and what the knowledge is not misrepresented or decontextualized. So ensure that all those issues are met when you are dealing with digitizing Indigenous knowledge in this digital era. And then you can pair reusability with ethics. Here we are saying that Indigenous knowledge data should be reusable with clear terms for how it can be applied in other contexts under appropriate licenses. And then the issue of ethical considerations, it must govern the reuse of Indigenous knowledge, ensuring it is not misappropriated or commercialized without the consent of the original community. Let's say you have managed to get some Indigenous knowledge from the knowledge holders, you want to commercialize it, ensure that you engage the Indigenous communities and don't commercialize it before getting their consent, because here we are also looking at the collective benefit of the Indigenous communities. What is it that the Indigenous community will benefit when you commercialize it? Because after commercializing, you're going to sell the products. When you sell the products, did you consider where you got the data? Are they going to benefit from what you're going to get as a result of commercializing the Indigenous data? And then collaborating with Indigenous communities to develop culturally appropriate terms of use and guidelines that prioritize ethics in the reuse of Indigenous knowledge. And then you also need to apply licenses that apply with ethical guidelines specific to Indigenous knowledge, such as traditional knowledge and Indigenous data sovereignty licenses, and ensure that the users are bound by community-specific rules regarding how the knowledge can be utilized. And then as recommendations, I can say that there is need to develop community-led governance models. Ensure that you work with the community as you develop the governance models of how to make use and access Indigenous data. And then apply culturally appropriate metadata systems, whereby you're saying that within the metadata, there should be Indigenous terms and Indigenous languages that can allow the use and access of Indigenous knowledge as you be documenting and archive the Indigenous knowledge. And then you need to foster collaborative partnerships. Partner with the Indigenous communities, partner with other organizations that are dealing with Indigenous knowledge to ensure that you'll be able to balance the fair and the care principles. And also there's a need to create legal frameworks to protect Indigenous knowledge. Within the policymakers, there's need to work hard and ensure that within the laws that are passed in the country, there is a need to protect Indigenous knowledge. And then also develop Indigenous-centric digital technologies. Taking, for example, the Mukutu content management system. That one is Indigenous-centric because it was developed with working with the Indigenous communities, and they played a bigger role in ensuring that what they wanted was within also the content management system. And then we can't run away from the issue of capacity building. Build capacity within all the stakeholders that work with Indigenous people, be it researchers, be it data stewards, be it the libraries, be it the and the issue of community engagement. Engage the Indigenous community so that they are fair principles. So in conclusion, I was saying that digital technologies, they offer a range of tools to capture, store, and share IK in ways that respect its cultural context and ownership, and creating governance structures and digital tools that respect Indigenous sovereignty, cultural values, and intellectual property is key, just like what we've pointed out when we talked about the Mukutu project, whereby we are saying that the Indigenous people were part and parcel of the activities that were done to come out with the content management system, right? So I was talking about the Mukutu project, whereby saying the Indigenous community were part and parcel of those who developed the system. And then the preservation of IK in this digital era, it requires an approach that respects the rights of Indigenous communities while also embracing the benefits of data accessibility and reusability. And integrating the care and fair principles provides a pathway for achieving this balance, but it also requires collaborative efforts between Indigenous communities, researchers, and technologies, as well as the policymakers, to ensure that within the policies, the issue of care and fair principles are taken into consideration. And people working with Indigenous people should be care and fair to ensure that Indigenous rights and interests of individual communities are respected while preserving IK in the digital era. So in conclusion, I can say that let's always be fair and care. With that, I thank you.